The time of the judges. Like I said, kind of a unique time period in world history. So far in this course, we've talked about several different approaches to structure, several different types of government. We talked about dictatorships towards the start of class when we talked about start of the semester when we talked about ancient riverine civilizations. Well, that's one approach to having a form of government, just having one person or at best a group of people, a small group of people in charge of everything. We've talked about democracy when we talked about ancient Athens. That's another approach to a form of government. You'll remember we talked about a republic when we talked about ancient Rome. You might even remember Plato's republic, that imaginary form of government that Plato thought about with a benevolent dictator, a philosopher king. Well, here we have yet another approach to government, which is not to have one at all. No political structure at all. Well, it's another approach to government, just not have one. There's no king, no court system, no legislature, no police officers, no laws in the sense of speed limit laws. There aren't those kind of laws. Now, there are moral laws. There are laws about how you treat people in society. There are laws about how you behave. There are moral laws. There are religious laws and ritual laws about how to make the sacrifices, animal sacrifices for the Hebrew people, how to make the sacrifices right, how to go through certain ritual washings at certain times of life, what kind of food you can eat and what kind of food you can't eat, those kind of laws. But there's no kind of laws like don't tear the tag off the mattress kind of laws. There aren't any of those kind of laws. Instead, the phrase that you hear over and over again as you read the book of the Judges, and now we move to the seventh book in the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, over and over again in the book of Judges, you hear the phrase, everybody did what they thought was right. Everybody did what they thought was right. It's an interesting political theory. The idea seems to be that if you teach children how to behave, if you teach children how to behave in society, how to treat people, and then when they grow up, if they just do what they think is right, then, you don't need a police officer on every street corner. You don't need a whole small claims court system to deal with petty disputes because, everybody will do what they think is right. You don't need a speed limit law saying that you can't drive faster than 35 miles per hour in a residential area because, of course, if you do what you think is right, and if you're driving a car and you get close to a bunch of houses, well, of course you're going to slow down. Because children live in places where there are lots of houses, some kids might be playing, some kid might come running out in the street, and so of course you're going to slow down. You don't need some kind of law telling you to do that because you're going to do what you think is right. It's an interesting political system. But as you can imagine, it wasn't particularly effective. Not a very efficient and effective system of government. You can pretty quickly begin to see some shortfalls and some shortcomings with that approach to setting up a political structure. You can very quickly come up with some problems. And in fact, if you do read the book of Judges, by the end of the book, that refrain, everybody did what they thought was right, becomes very bitter and sarcastic because the writer will describe horrible, absolutely horrible things going on and then say everybody did what they thought was right. It becomes very bitter. As social conditions deteriorate, absolutely horrible things happen, and the other writer says, see, everybody did what they thought was right. It becomes very bitter and sarcastic. And, as you can quickly figure out, sometimes it's kind of nice to have a government. Especially, for example, when the bad guys show up, when the bad guys invade. The bad guys invade, they're running around the countryside, burning stuff, stealing stuff, and the people have to wait. They have to wait for somebody to stand up and say, I'm anointed to be a judge. Somebody stands up and says, I'm anointed to be a judge. Now, two things about what I just said. First, the first one kind of important, the second one very important. The first one, which is kind of important, is the use of the word judge here. As I mentioned to you earlier, oftentimes in the story, as the story's been told and retold over and over and over again for thousands of years in Western culture, old-fashioned words have gotten stuck to the story. And here we've got an old-fashioned use of the word judge here. This use of the word judge just simply means any leader who's authorized to make decisions, who has the authority to make decisions. It just means a leader with authority. Today we limit that word judge. We tend to think about somebody in a courtroom. Okay, I'm informed that there's a problem with the Panoptos session for the Hebrew Legacy 4. And although I am at quite some distance from the College of Central Florida, nowhere close, you might be surprised to discover where I am. And just in case you don't get the wrong impression, I'm definitely not on vacation. But decidedly not on vacation. But through the wonders of the internet and the World Wide Web, I'm going to be able to fill in the gaps. Well, you got started learning about the judges. There's a time when there's no government, no political system, that kind of thing. The bad guys show up, and the people have to wait until somebody stands up and says, I'm anointed to be a judge. And I was just at the point of telling you about this word judge, as the first thing you need to know about what I just said there. And I left off, or that Panopto session broke, right at the point where I was telling you that because the story has been told over and over again, that some old-fashioned words have gotten stuck to the story. Well, judge is one of these words. Today, we limit that word judge to someone in a courtroom, like, I'm not used to this computer either. Here we go. To a judge, like Judge Joe Brown or Judge Judy or one of those kind of judges. That was a honeybee. There he is back again. Okay, there's a clue. I'm somewhere in a place where there are honeybees around. Judges. And a cat of some sort. Judges. Today we kind of limit them. Okay, you've gotten to see Judge Joe Brown and Judge Judy. That word judge simply means anyone authorized to make decisions. And although today we kind of limit that to someone in a courtroom, in a civil case or a criminal case or a probate case or what have you, then it might be misleading if you think about that. That be kind of through me. Okay, that's the stuff that's kind of important. Not really all that important, so that was okay for the B to show up. The really important part, though, is the word anointed. That's the really important part here. This concept of anointing is going to show up over and over again in the course. The word anointed, the English word anointed, means chosen to do a special job. It simply means chosen to do a special job. In this context, of course, it means chosen by God to do a special job. And so when someone stands up and says, God has anointed me to be a judge, what they're really saying is God's chosen me to be the leader. But of course, these people are pretty smart. They know that not everybody who stands up and says God's chosen me to be the leader actually has been chosen by God to be the leader. And so there's a time of testing and demonstrating that this person really has been chosen to be a judge. And so the people have to wait until somebody says God's chosen me to be the leader. Now, there's a variety of judges. There are male judges and female judges and old judges and young judges and one judge who isn't even a Hebrew person at all. I think there are 17 judges. I think there's 17 mentioned by name, and the implication is that there are some others as well. But the people have to wait until someone stands up and says, God's anointed me to be a judge. And then after a time of testing or demonstrating that this person really has been chosen to be the judge, then in a simple ceremony, usually before the representatives of the big families among the people, one of the religious leaders, usually the high priest, usually we tend to use the word priest. It's an old English word. It means older person, elder, to translate the Hebrew word here. But a priest gets up and in a simple ritual before representatives of the big families among the people, he takes a little bit of olive oil, maybe just a teaspoon, and he pours it over the head of the person who's been chosen to be the judge. And that application of olive oil is a symbol to everyone that now this person is recognized as the judge.
This person does have the authority to go out and take care of the bad guys or deal with whatever problem is out there. B is back. Oh well. If I jump up real fast, you'll know why. So we're at this concept of anointing and the application of olive oil. The application of olive oil as a symbol that this person has been anointed becomes so connected to the idea of being anointed that even in the English word anointed, the idea of oil is buried in the word. The oint part of the word here, the oint part of the word there comes from an old Latin word that means oil. Just like ointment, medicine that's in an oil base so that the medicine sticks to where your injury is. So the idea of oil is buried here right in the English word anointed. Now the word anointed doesn't mean olive oil. It means chosen to do a special job. But the idea of olive oil being applied to the head becomes so connected to anointed, the concept of anointing, that even the English word anointed has the concept of oil in it. Well, now we have, and like I said, this concept of anointing is going to be very important. It's going to show up several times in our story this semester. Well, now there's a judge. Now the judge has been anointed. Now the judge has the authority to go around to raise an army, to recruit an army, and then chase away the bad guys. But it's not a very effective system. It's not a very efficient system. First, the bad guys show up, and the people have to sit around and wait. They have to wait until somebody says, I'm anointed to be a judge. They have to wait for a time of testing and trial and that kind of thing. They have to wait for the high priest to gather the representatives from the big families. The high priest has to find some olive oil, apply it to the head, and now the judge has the authority to recruit an army and train an army, and then can go off chasing around the countryside, getting the bad guys out. But it's not a very effective system. It's not a very efficient system. And increasingly there's a call from the people that they want a king. Yes, that's a Bud Light. I'm nowhere close to campus. But the people say they want a king. They say, maybe if we had a king around here, we wouldn't get invaded all the time. And if we did get invaded, then we'd already have a king and an army, and they could go ahead and chase away the bad guys, and we wouldn't have to wait for this process to happen. Well, this call for a king. Oh, and they said, besides, we want to be like the other countries. All the other countries have kings. We want to have a king. We want to be like the other countries. It's embarrassing not having a king. Travelers pass through our country and they say, who's your king around here? And we have to say, we don't have one. It's embarrassing not having a king. Well, this call for a king is highly unpopular with the last of the judges, and that's a guy named Samuel. Samuel is a major figure in the story, in the Hebrew story. I think even a lot of people who are familiar with the story don't understand how crucial Samuel is for the Hebrew story. In a lot of ways, he's the last of the judges. In a lot of ways, he's the first of the prophets. And I want to be talking about the prophets in a later session. He's one of the major pivotal characters in the story. Well, I've already told you that Samuel is the last of the judges, so that tells you where the story's going here, at least. But this call for a king is highly unpopular. He's persistent. Well, this call for a king is not very popular with Samuel. Samuel says, I should take care of him for a while. Samuel says, look, you don't want a king. You want me to be in charge. I'm the judge. I've got experience. I mean, everything's going just fine. Just leave things alone. Just let me be the judge, and you don't need any king. And the people say, no, we want a king. We want to be like the other countries. And Samuel says, look, you don't want a king. If you get a king, he's going to put income taxes on you. He's going to come up with silly speed limit kind of laws. He's going to draft your sons into the army. You don't want a king. And people say, no, we want a king. And Samuel says, look, if you need a king, let's see, who around here would make a good king? Who would be a good king? I know, I'll be your king. And the people said, no, we don't want you to be our king because your two sons are bums and crooks, and we don't want them to be king when you're dead. And Samuel said, oh, okay. You want a king? I'll give you a king. And we enter a time period in Hebrew history that historians call the United Monarchy. Although it's going to take a while to figure out why it's called the United Monarchy, because it doesn't seem very united at first. Well, this is the material that should fill in the gap in that problem with the Hebrew Legacy Part 4. So we'll pick this up in the next Panopto session.
The United Monarchy, like I said, it might take us a while to figure out why it's called the United Monarchy, because it certainly doesn't sound very united at first at all. Especially not the story on the ground, we'll say. Especially not looking simply at the political story. It doesn't seem very united at all. Well, Samuel goes to a young man named Saul. And now this is very important to the story. Samuel takes a little bit of olive oil with him, and he says to Saul, Saul, you are anointed king. And he takes the olive oil, and he pours just that little bit of olive oil, maybe a tablespoon, over the head of Saul, and says, you are anointed king. You see, that's the same ritual that had developed for the judges, and now it's being applied to the new king. The same vocabulary of anointing, being chosen by God, the same symbol, the application of olive oil, the same language, the same vocabulary, the same ritual is now transferred from the judges to the king. That's going to be significant later. But then Samuel goes to another young man, a young man named David, and says, no, wait a minute, you're anointed king. He takes a little bit of olive oil and he applies it to David's head. Well, on the ground, you have two different men making the same claim to being king. They've both been anointed by the same person, Samuel, who's used the same wording, the same ritual. They're eyewitnesses and so on. And so it doesn't look very united at all. The writer of the story, though, tells us something which is significant on two different levels, or in two different ways. What the writer says is significant. Saul has done something. He's really messed up. He's really messed up, and God has rejected Saul from being king. On the ground, what we see is a civil war. A civil war being fought by two armies. One army loyal to Saul, the other army loyal to David. Behind the scenes, though, the writer tells us that God has rejected Saul from being king. There's more to the story, you see, than just what we see in the political events on the ground. That's part of the point of the story here. Another point is that the same rules apply to Saul, even though he's king. Just because he's king, he's not exempt from the rules. When Saul breaks the rules, well, the same rules apply to Saul that apply to everybody else. Nobody is above the law. That's an important principle, an important concept, and one that I'll be coming back and saying some things about later in talking and evaluating the Hebrew legacy. But as far as the story on the ground goes, well, you have a civil war. You have two men making the same claim to being king. They both have the same experience of the same man, Samuel, coming, saying the same words, applying the olive oil in the same way, and so on. It's a civil war that lasts for about 7 years, but eventually David wins and becomes the new king, and in a lot of ways the first undisputed king of this new country. The first undisputed king of this new country. Well, if now you have a king and a new country, well then you need to have a name for your country. I mean, how embarrassing would that be? To fight a civil war for 7 years over who's going to be the king and still not have a name for your country. They have to come up with a name for their country. For a name for their country, these people go way back in the story they tell about themselves. Way back in the story they tell about their ancestors, all the way back to the man they call their third patriarch. In this course so far, I've mentioned the first patriarch, Abraham. Abraham's son, Isaac, is the second patriarch. And now they go back to a story about Abraham's grandson, a story about a man named Jacob. is an interesting story. It's an interesting story in that the story provides the name for this new nation. And I want to tell you that story.